Well, thank you very much. Could I first say just how grateful I am to be invited to speak today. I think this is an excellent and timely occasion, coinciding with the latest round of the FMRD and also coming just before the next round of TTIP negotiations. I don't think QED could have chosen a better moment, really, for this. I'm also very glad to be speaking representing the City UK. Perhaps I should just say we're a member-based organisation and we represent UK financial and related professional services, so a huge range from banking, insurance, legal services, accounting. Our membership accounts for about 13, our sector accounts for 13.5% of UK GDP, 12% of UK tax receipts, and employs 2 million people, 2/3 of them outside London. And London itself is an EU asset, obviously, and also one of the 2 global financial centres in the world. My role is to chair a committee called the Liberalisation of Trade in Services, LOTIS, it's called, committee, which is actually much older than the City UK. It goes all the way back to the oil crisis of the early 1970s, when both government and the private sector began to realise that the UK in particular would have to think about both its oil deficit and also its non-oil deficit, and within the non-oil deficit, the components that were positive in the balance of payments, of which services were identified, not just financial services, as a very big component. And this committee has really been sitting since then to provide a dialogue with government on the role of services and how the interests of services can be catered for in UK policy. Well, I'd like to structure what I say around the 4 suggested points that the conference organisers have invited us to speak on, though I'm not going to stick rigidly to them. The first question was is TTIP the right forum for looking at financial regulation, and how could one integrate financial regulation into TTIP? Well, we certainly believe that it is the right forum. I should say at once that we structure our thoughts really go first to all forms of regulatory dialogue, that they need to be disciplined, they need to be transparent, they need to be timely, that is, not tackle issues long after they've arisen, but if possible anticipate those issues and frame solutions for them. They need to be accountable. It all adds up to an ex-ante approach, not an ex-post approach. And 2 things that previous speakers have mentioned. Mark Sobel is of course right, and we would never dispute this, that the prudential aspect and financial stability are the key. There's no question of detracting from those. And as Paulina has said, any dialogue needs to be problem-solving. It's no use just comparing notes on predicaments. There has to be some kind of solution. Can all this be applied in TTIP? Well, we certainly believe that it can, but I want to be clear about a number of things, because our American colleagues, particularly from the American Treasury, have sometimes raised these as issues to criticise our ideas. We do not seek to take away a regulatory dialogue from regulators. They are the only people capable of conducting a regulatory dialogue par excellence. We are not, and this is a point that Ignacio Garcia Becerra also made, we're not trying to put it in the hands of trade negotiators who are not qualified to conduct this kind of discussion. We're not, needless to say, trying to undermine the independence of regulators on either side of the Atlantic. And certainly we're not seeking to undermine Dodd-Frank. I think it's interesting that there's this suspicion that one might be trying to undermine Dodd-Frank, because it's essentially a backward-looking suspicion that the idea is to undo what's already in place. The whole point is to look forward at improving the future dialogue and problem solving, not somehow to look into the past issues. And from that point of view, we do have a number of criticisms of the present financial markets regulatory dialogue, and we do have a number of thoughts on ways it could be improved. For one thing, it's an institution that dates from before the crisis. It was set up in 2002. I think the way the crisis has supervened on almost everything that affects all of us, institutions set up before it, one has to raise questions about whether their terms of reference and their method of approach are still the right ones. It meets only in intermittent session. I think the sessions are getting a bit less intermittent than they were, but it's still intermittent. Is it equal to current pressures of work? Well, I'm not sure that it is. It's certainly an open question. Does it have systems for reporting to market stakeholders? Well, there have begun to be press releases and joint statements, and the press release or joint statement that we'll see later today is going to be an example of that. But that, I think, is a fairly recent development. It's been difficult for stakeholders to follow what happens in the FMRD, and the FMRD process itself doesn't really seem to be open to information on market predicaments and how they might be solved. It's certainly not clear to our members as stakeholders how the business predicaments and compliance predicaments that we encounter can readily be brought forward and upwards so that they can actually be tackled within the FMRD. So we do think that it could be improved, and we do think that TTIP would be a way of improving it. After all, as a number of speakers have said, and notably Ignacio Garcia Becerro, TTIP is designed to address regulatory issues across the field of goods and services. That's its whole purpose. That's what the leaders of the two sides agreed it needed to do if it was going to take forward further market opening between these two very advanced economic groups. So it would be perverse not to include financial services in a joint enterprise that has this particular objectives. If one's going to improve it, what should the central requirements be? Well, there needs to be an agreed framework for cooperation. There needs to be agreement on the scope that that framework will have. Ignacio, again, outlined some of what that would be. There needs to be agreement on the principles, mutual reliance and approaches to equivalence. There needs to be joint bilateral mechanisms for consultations. There need to be review procedures. And I think, very importantly, there needs also to be an understanding on the terms and the moment when one side or the other would be able to revert to its own rules if it really became dissatisfied or lacked trust in whether the agreement was working. So there need to be those features, and there need to be some specific objectives. There needs to be a determination to achieve greater compatibility of legislation. Now that means not just dialogue, but also feedback and impact assessment. There needs to be, and I think this is quite difficult actually, tackling legislation and rule-making, a deeper agreement to look at each other's views, and a deeper understanding of whether each side is ready to take account of the views of the other. Now, I think this is trickier than may appear at first sight. It involves questions of privileged access to the thinking of the other side. How does one get around, say, consultation processes that happen on both sides in order for regulators to think ahead in some agreed way on whether they can have a degree of convergent thinking in the approaches that they'll use to address a particular problem, even before they get to consultation. This quite quickly gets involved in difficult constitutional questions on both sides, but is, I think, unavoidable that it has to be tackled. I think those are all issues that, we don't deny the difficulty, but we do see them as important. Should the EU and the United States lead the way, or should we move away from EU-US dialogue to global dialogue? Well, Karel Lano has already anticipated much of what I was going to say, that I think this is really a market-driven decision. The EU and US economies together at 12% of the global population, but nearly half of global GDP, 30% of global trade, and there's the figures that Karel has already quoted, which are much, much higher percentages when we get to financial services, 58% of banking assets and so on, all the way upwards to 86% of OTC derivatives trading. Our two sides need to cope with those questions and demonstrate that we are able to cope with them, because if we can't, I think it's questionable whether on some wider global scale it will be at all easy to do so. I think there's also two other points. At the moment, our two markets still enjoy global leadership in many of these issues. But that's reducing, it's not increasing. Other competitor markets are growing. Other speakers have referred to Asian views on these things. So this is probably our last best chance to influence the global dialogue in the way we would like to do so, and the way in which it's in our interest to do so. So I don't say there will not be a global dialogue, but I think it will be challenging. And we do at this moment still have an opportunity to set a template for it. How can we foresee the role of other international bodies, the G20, the FSB, IOSCO? Well,
John, may I just ask you the panel section, because
right.
Getting to combine these.
Yes. Well, I think I can leave that because I don't have all that much to say, except that I think if we look at international standard setters, if there's a question of giving greater power to them, the sovereignty pooling issues are even greater than in TTIP and on a less foreseeable basis. Well, I think that really concludes what I have to say. It's very much said from a business perspective of the users and those who have to comply with the rules, but I hope it makes sense. Thank you.